Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin. This is Life, Liberty, and Levin, and I have a great guest, Rick Harrison. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. I little bit of job here. I started buying and selling stuff. Basically educated myself, and then I'd always been buying and selling stuff. My dad had a little coin shop, and I wanted a pawn shop.
For years, Rick Harrison was the steady face of Pawn Stars, calm under pressure, sharp with numbers, and always one step ahead of the deal. Viewers saw him as untouchable, a man who turned everyday negotiations into television gold and built an empire on knowledge, instinct, and discipline. To many fans, Rick Harrison was stability. That's why what's happening now has left so many people stunned. Because this time, it's not about a bad deal or a tough customer across the counter. It's about how quickly everything that once felt permanent can begin to slip away. The success, the routine, the sense of control, all of it has been tested in ways Rick never expected. And while headlines may exaggerate, the truth is far more sobering than any dramatic claim. Behind the familiar setting and confident tone was a man carrying pressures the cameras never fully captured. Fame changed the business. Expectations grew heavier. Personal challenges collided with public scrutiny. And slowly, the world Rick had carefully built began to feel less certain than it once did. Fans asking, what happened to Rick Harrison? Aren't just curious about money or television ratings. They're reacting to something deeper. The realization that even those who seem to have it all are vulnerable to loss, change, and hard resets. What Rick is facing now isn't about losing everything overnight. It's about confronting how fragile success can be when life shifts direction. And once you understand what Rick Harrison has truly been dealing with, you start to see this story not as a downfall, but as a turning point no one saw coming. Rick Harrison didn't become a household name overnight. Long before Pawn Stars turned his family business into a global phenomenon, Rick was simply a man trying to keep a small operation alive in a tough city. The gold and silver pawn shop wasn't built on glamour. It was built on discipline, long hours, and a deep understanding of risk. That foundation is important because it explains why the changes Rick is facing now feel so devastating to fans, who believed his success was unshakable. When the show first aired, Rick was portrayed as the voice of reason. He negotiated firmly, avoided emotional decisions, and rarely let sentiment cloud business judgment. Viewers trusted him. Over time, that trust turned into an image of invincibility. Rick wasn't just successful, he was consistent. And consistency, when seen week after week, creates the illusion of permanence. But fame changed the environment around him. The pawn shop was no longer just a business, it became a destination. Expectations shifted. Every decision was scrutinized, every move interpreted through the lens of television narrative. While the show brought wealth and opportunity, it also brought pressure that never truly turned off. Rick wasn't just running a shop anymore. He was managing a brand tied to public perception. Behind the scenes, that pressure slowly accumulated. Business dynamics evolved, relationships were tested, and the balance between reality and entertainment grew harder to maintain. Rick has spoken in the past about how the show altered daily life in ways viewers never saw. Privacy became limited. Routine disappeared. And what once felt like control started to feel like obligation. At the same time, personal challenges added weight to an already demanding reality. Life doesn't pause for success, and Rick's responsibilities extended far beyond the shop counter. Managing expectations, both public and private, required constant emotional restraint. The version of Rick fans saw on screen represented confidence, but confidence doesn't erase strain. What many people don't realize is that losing everything doesn't always mean financial collapse. Sometimes it means losing certainty. Losing the rhythm that once made life predictable. Losing the sense that tomorrow will look like yesterday. For Rick, the foundation he relied on began to shift, not suddenly, but gradually enough that it was difficult to recognize until the change became unavoidable. Section 1 establishes the truth behind the headline. Rick Harrison didn't wake up one day with nothing. What he began to lose was stability, the kind built over decades. And when stability erodes, even success can start to feel fragile. This is where the story truly begins. Not with collapse, but with change. And for someone like Rick Harrison, Change may be the most difficult negotiation he's ever faced. As time went on, the challenges Rick Harrison faced grew more complex. The pawn shop that had once been a stable foundation began to feel like shifting ground. What made this period particularly difficult wasn't sudden catastrophe. It was the slow accumulation of pressures that made each day more unpredictable than the last. Business decisions that once seemed straightforward now carried heavier consequences. And every choice had to be weighed against both financial and personal stakes. Television had transformed Rick's world in ways few could anticipate. The shop wasn't just a place to buy and sell items anymore. It was a brand, a cultural touchstone, and a global phenomenon. Every negotiation, every handshake, every decision carried an unspoken expectation from fans, investors, and even his own team. The line between personal judgment and public performance began to blur. It was no longer enough to make smart deals. He had to make them in ways that satisfied viewers' expectations while protecting the integrity of the business. On top of that, external factors began to create ripple effects. Market trends, changing consumer behavior, and economic fluctuations put additional strain on the business. Items that once guaranteed profit could no longer be relied upon, and strategies that had worked for years required constant reevaluation. The foundation Rick had spent decades building suddenly felt less predictable, and that uncertainty weighed on him. Personal pressures added another layer. Managing a family, maintaining public image, and sustaining personal relationships became increasingly difficult, as the shop demanded more of his time and energy. What viewers saw as calm confidence often masked the reality of juggling multiple responsibilities simultaneously. Behind the counter, Rick faced decisions that weren't just about deals. They were about legacy, reputation, and the long-term survival of the business. Perhaps the most difficult aspect was adapting to change. For decades, Rick's approach had been consistent, disciplined, and methodical. But as circumstances shifted, old habits became less effective. He had to find new ways to negotiate, innovate, and protect what he had built, all while under the scrutiny of an audience that assumed he could handle anything. That kind of pressure can be isolating, even for someone as experienced as Rick Harrison. Section 2 highlights the slow erosion of stability in Rick's life. The loss he faced wasn't sudden or sensationalized. It was the accumulation of stress, changing circumstances, and relentless expectation. For a man who built his success through knowledge, discipline, and careful judgment, learning to navigate instability was a challenge he had never anticipated. And this stage set the scene for the most pivotal moments yet, when adaptation would become not just a choice, but a necessity for survival. As Rick Harrison confronted the growing instability in his life and business, the reality became impossible to ignore. The confidence that had defined him for decades now faced constant testing, both from within and outside the pawn shop. Every negotiation, every decision, and every public appearance carried more weight than ever before. The experience was no longer just about running a business. It had become a lesson in resilience under pressure. By this point, Rick understood that success is fragile. The systems he had relied on for years, relationships with collectors, market patterns, even public trust, were all subject to change. What once felt like predictability turned into unpredictability. Deals that would have seemed like guarantees now required additional caution and strategy. The lessons of the past, while valuable, could no longer ensure the same outcomes. Every move had to be reconsidered, and every decision carried a lingering question. Would this work in today's environment? Personal challenges compounded the stress. Fame, which had once been a benefit, increasingly added pressure. Fans and media scrutinized his every action, amplifying mistakes and reducing the room for error. Family and personal responsibilities didn't pause for crises. In fact, they became more urgent, demanding attention while he managed the fallout of unforeseen setbacks in his professional life. This dual responsibility, protecting a public image while safeguarding private stability, was exhausting and relentless. Adapting to these circumstances required not just business acumen, but emotional endurance. Rick had to reevaluate priorities, make difficult decisions, and sometimes accept outcomes he could not control. It wasn't about giving up. It was about recalibrating. Every challenge demanded both experience and humility. For a man who had spent a lifetime relying on knowledge and instinct, the unpredictable nature of the situation tested more than his skills. It tested his patience and judgment. During this period, Rick also recognized the importance of support systems. Trusted advisors, family members, and long-term colleagues became critical anchors. Relying on others was not always easy for someone accustomed to independence and authority, but collaboration became necessary. The ability to delegate, to trust, and to adapt under pressure was as important as any negotiation skill he had. Learned over decades. Section 3 captures the emotional and strategic turning point in Rick Harrison's journey. This is where the stakes became tangible, the pressure unavoidable, and the need for adaptation absolute. The challenges he faced were no longer hypothetical. They were immediate, demanding, and inescapable. And it was in navigating this stage that Rick demonstrated not just business savvy, but resilience, determination, and the capacity to endure when everything felt like it was slipping away. This sets the stage for the moment where decisions, consequences, and resilience converge, defining the future of Rick Harrison, both personally and professionally. The of Rick Harrison's journey through uncertainty isn't about dramatic collapse or sensational headlines, it's about reckoning and adaptation. After years of steady success, he faced a reality that tested the limits of experience, patience, and resilience. What he was losing wasn't always tangible wealth. It was the sense of control and predictability he had built his life around. And for someone whose identity was tied closely to his business acumen, that loss hit harder than anyone outside could imagine. In navigating this period, Rick had to make choices that were as much about personal survival as they were about professional strategy. Every deal, every negotiation, and every interaction carried added significance. Mistakes, once easily absorbed, now had ripple effects. Fans and media scrutinized his every action, intensifying the pressure. For a man who had spent decades projecting confidence and certainty, the experience of vulnerability was humbling and transformative. Yet, despite the challenges, Rick's response demonstrated the core of his character. He leaned on the systems, relationships, and support networks he had cultivated over decades. Trusted advisors, longtime colleagues, and family became pillars, providing guidance, perspective, and reinforcement when the weight of uncertainty felt heaviest. He adapted not by abandoning his principles, but by applying them with greater flexibility, understanding that rigidity could no longer serve him. Perhaps the most significant aspect of this stage is perspective. Losing everything isn't always about financial ruin. Sometimes it's about realizing that stability is conditional and that resilience requires reinvention. Rick Harrison faced this truth head-on, confronting the fragility of success while preserving the elements that mattered most: integrity, expertise, and connection to those who had supported him from the beginning. This period also emphasized growth. The challenges he faced didn't diminish his achievements. They reframed them. Rick learned that enduring change requires both pragmatism and emotional endurance. The lessons from this stage are universal. Success is temporary if it isn't nurtured, and resilience is built not just in triumph, but in adversity. Section 4 concludes the story by highlighting how Rick Harrison responded to loss, uncertainty, and evolving circumstances. This isn't a story of defeat, it's a story of adaptation, perseverance, and strategic recalibration. What he experienced reminds us that even those who seem invincible must navigate periods of vulnerability and change. And in facing these challenges, Rick didn't just preserve a legacy, he reinforced it, showing that resilience can turn even the toughest setbacks into opportunities for reinvention and growth. The story of Rick Harrison's recent struggles is ultimately one of endurance. It shows that while the world can change around us, the ability to adapt, reflect, and rebuild defines true strength. A lesson as valuable off the screen as it is in the pawn shop.